This study highlights the progression of ecological succession due to hurricane disturbance in Point Pleasant Park. On September 28th and 29th, 2003, a major hurricane blew through Halifax, known as Hurricane Waugh, and this caused many devastating ecological deficits to the surrounding areas, including Point Pleasant Park. The park was closed for 8 months, which further led to the opportunity to assess the effects that disturbance can cause to a well-established area. Ecology is the scientific study of relationships between organisms and their environment. Forest community succession is the change in animal and plant species compositions and structure over time in a forest ecosystem. And climax community is a stable and mature ecological community that has reached equilibrium. An acronym you may see is DBH, which is diameter at breast height. So in Point Pleasant Park, it is a naturalized forest, meaning it is as natural as possible with modest intervention. Point Pleasant Park was very important to the Mi'kmaq Nation. It was significant because it was a gathering place known as Amtikare, and this meant spiritual place. Every year, the Mi'kmaq from all over Mi'kma'ki would come and gather at Point Pleasant Park for 7 days after the first full moon. This was during the frog croaking month in the spring. The Mi'kmaq protected it very fiercely, and it was thus very important. So the objectives of this study was to determine how the overall forest community has changed over time and the effect of the community as the forest moves towards climax community. It was also to determine how the density of the dominant species in 2004 and dominant species in 2023 has changed over time, further predicting what will happen to the dominant species and community metrics as the forest moves towards climax community. It was also to determine how the chosen community metric has changed over time and the results as the forest moves towards climatic community. It was hypothesized that as time goes on, forest density, species richness, and dominant species density will rise over time, whereas DBH and evenness will reduce over time as less tree coverage will allow for small trees to colonize the forest.
Data was collected by Ecology 2060 students in Point Pleasant Park in Halifax, Nova Scotia, ranging from the years 2004 and then every year up until 2022. The 6 distinct study sites shown in the image on the left were selected as they had the highest impact on forest structure due to the disturbance of the 2003 Hurricane Juan. Collected data included in our presentation includes total forest community density and species-specific density of the red maple and red spruce, collected by identifying all species within the study sites. It also includes species richness and species evenness, which was calculated using these species densities via the Shannon index calculations, and also diameter at breast height, or DBH, in centimeters of all trees within the study sites above 2.5 centimeters. All data included in our presentation was analyzed using Excel and graphed in that same software, with all those graphs being created by the Ecology 2060 lab teaching team. Linear regression analysis was chosen to show relationships, either positive or negative, between all of our aforementioned dependent variables and the time since the hurricane had occurred. This allows us to explore the progression of ecological succession in the park post-Hurricane Juan and to see the effects over time on density, diameter at breast height, and species richness and evenness in the park. By looking at Figure 1, we can see that the total density of the Point Pleasant Park community has increased over the years after the hurricane, with the graph having a positive slope of 10.057. The total density measured in 2022 was approximately 31 times larger than the density measured in 2004, 1 year after the hurricane. We believe that this is due to a secondary succession event occurring within the forest study sites, where the disturbance of the hurricane destroyed many larger canopy trees, allowing the recruitment of smaller tree species due to a greater availability of resources and light, which increased total forest densities in the years after the environmental disturbance. Further evidence of this secondary succession event can be found in Figure 2, which shows the diameter at breast height of trees measured in Point Pleasant Park study sites after the hurricane, as the graph has a negative slope of negative 0.5554. The average diameter at breast height measured in 2022 of 5.59 centimeters was approximately 3.1 times smaller than the average diameter at breast height measured in 2004 of 17.425 centimeters. We believe this points to the recruitment of new, younger trees due to secondary succession in the years after the hurricane. As the community continues to grow towards its climax community, younger trees will grow into maturity, raising the average diameter at breast height. But as the disturbance/secondary succession allows a shift in dominant species, which we believe to be smaller tree species, the diameter at breast height will likely not reach the height of those original trees still present in 2004. Additionally, as new tree colonization stabilizes over time, so will the forest community density as the study sites move towards their climax community.
The density of species red spruce and red maple have both increased over time from 2004 to 2022. The slope of the graphs indicate the rate at which the density of each dominant tree species changed over time. For both dominant species, there is a positive slope. In Figure 4, the slope of red maple is higher than that of red spruce in Figure 3, indicating a faster and more significant rate of change of density over time for the red maple species. The red spruce species has a slower and less significant rate of change. There is a positive relationship between the density of these tree species in the years gone by since the hurricane hit in 2003. The resilience of both tree species can be seen in their ability to increase in density after the hurricane hit. It should be taken into consideration that these trees were originally planted for military purposes, which could explain their abundance compared to the other tree species that are currently at Point Pleasant. The shift in dominant tree species over time represents the progression of a secondary succession. Red spruce was the dominant tree species in 2004, and red maple was the dominant tree species in 2022. The composition of tree species shifted to favor species better adapted to the progression of succession. Red maple has advantages over red spruce, including being highly adaptable. A highly adaptable species is likely to increase in dominance over time as the forest matures. Red maples are known as generalist species, meaning they can tolerate a wide range of habitat conditions. The ability of red maple to adapt to disturbances and changes in environmental conditions after the hurricane hit in 2004 allowed them to thrive and dominate the forest by 2022.
As the dominant species, red spruce and red maple move toward their climax community, their growth rate will begin to plateau, and there will be a reduction in growth of other species in the community as there are less resources to be shared among new, unestablished species. This occurs because the trees are more capable of growing upward to encapsulate sunlight at a greater rate than other species, which reduces the amount of resources, like light, that low-growing species will receive. Some species who require more light will die, and those who have adapted to low-light environments will survive. The community diversity becomes stable and unchanged once the climax community is reached. The dominant species, like the spruce and maple, that were originally early pioneers in the forest will move into late successional species that will remain dominant in the urban forest. The disturbance from the hurricane will initially lead to higher diversity and stabilization compared to original forest distribution in Point Pleasant Park.
The community metric species richness, also known as S, which is the number of different species in a community, has had a substantial increase over the years of secondary succession on the flora of Point Pleasant Park, allowing for a high rate of establishment. This indicates that regeneration occurred of different species in the 6 study sites at the most impacted areas of the park. The linear regression analysis helps further analyze the data, as an R-squared value of 0.6551 means that a high level of different species can be attributed to the secondary succession. As the forest moves closer to the climax community, it is expected that the species richness may increase, but not as substantially. The species during the first year of succession were able to be undisturbed as migration and new growth occurred, increasing biomass. But the closer to climax community the forest moves, the fewer opportunities arise for new species to establish themselves, allowing the dominant species to outcompete the other species. Yacham et al. Helps further the indication that in the case of the paper, their establishment of the climatic species, being the red spruce, overtakes the reforestation of the pioneer species, which would begin to level out the species richness in a climax community. This data supports the hypothesis that an increase in species richness will be seen over time as less tree cover would allow for the new colonization in the forest. But as we get to a climax community, we would see a start to steady out of the species richness.
As demonstrated in this data analysis, Hurricane Juan accelerated secondary succession in Point Pleasant by removing the canopy tree cover and allowing other low-growing species to have access to natural light penetrated directly into the soil. Based on the data collected from the dominant red spruce and red maple, we can predict that the Acadian forest in Point Pleasant Park is currently in early to mid-stage succession due to their current amount of regrowth. Limitations with this study are that the data collected over the years were from different sites. This causes complications due to the variance and disturbance that occurred in the southeast part of the forest, which received the most impact from the hurricane, compared to the northwest side of the park. This study also shows that Point Pleasant is capable of successful secondary succession without intervention from humans, minus the fragmentations made with walking paths winding throughout the park. Point Pleasant has a unique history of succession, as it was originally used as a logging site for the military, so the disturbances the park often faced came from human sources, which in turn aided the secondary succession of native plants, as logging removed the non-native invasive species. Another example of how urban succession differs from naturally occurring succession is soil degradation. As soil pollution increases, the toxins hinder plant growth, decreasing plant diversity in urban communities, as fewer species are capable of surviving in hostile urban environments.
Learning to see in a way that incorporates both Indigenous ways of knowing and Western knowledge can influence our understanding and approach to assisting the recovery of Point Pleasant Park. The Mi'kmaq teaching of Netakalimk emphasizes the interdependence and interconnectedness of humans with the land. Alder Albert explains that coexistence, interrelatedness, interconnectedness, and community spirit brings us a sense of awareness which influences our relationship with others as well as with Mother Earth. An understanding of the interdependence between humans and nature promotes humans to take responsibility in taking care of the land.
The following references were used in the creation of this presentation. This work was supported by the Biology 2060 lab teaching team at Dalhousie University and would not have been possible without the assistance of our TA Shiori and our lab instructor Allison Schmidt. We also acknowledge that Dalhousie University is located on the ancestral and unceded territory of the traditional Mi'kmaq people. We also acknowledge that African Nova Scotians are a distinct people whose history, legacies, and contributions have enriched Nova Scotia for over 400 years.